Mom decided to help my golden brother, sold my apartment without my permission, but she didn't expect my determination. She said I had gone crazy, but I guess I always knew something was off about my family, but never in my wildest dreams did I think it would come to this. The betrayal, the lies, the sheer audacity of it all. My mother, Karen, the woman who raised me, had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. It all started about 6 months ago when I got a phone call from the real estate agency. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some kind of clerical error. They told me that the apartment I owned, the one my dad had left to me in his will, had been sold. The problem was, I hadn't authorized the sale. Hell, I hadn't even been thinking about selling it. That apartment had a lot of sentimental value to me. It was the last thing that connected me to him. The man on the other end of the phone said, "We received your signature on the papers, Daniel. The sale is final." I remember staring blankly at the wall, my brain struggling to process what I had just heard. Excuse me? What signature? I never signed any papers. Well, the papers were processed a month ago, and we have everything on file. Your signature included. That's when it hit me like a freight train. Someone had forged my signature, and that someone, it seemed, had access to everything. My personal documents, my ID, my accounts. But who? The only person with that level of access would have been Karen, my own mother. My stomach churned. No, there had to be some mistake. My mom would never do something like that, right? I hung up the phone, my head spinning. I had to confront her. That evening, I drove to her house. I could feel the anxiety crawling up my spine as I knocked on the door. She opened it with her usual warm smile, but I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. "Mom, we need to talk." "Of course, Daniel. What's wrong?" We sat down in the living room, and for a moment, I almost chickened out. Almost. But the thought of my dad's apartment, the one I was planning to move into in a few months, kept pushing me forward. I laid it all out, explaining what the real estate agent had said. When I mentioned the forgery, I saw her face change. It wasn't shock or confusion, but something else, a flash of guilt. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. She denied everything. "Daniel, that's ridiculous. Why would I forge your signature? Why would I sell your apartment? I don't even know how to handle something like that." I was thrown off. Her voice was so calm, so steady. Maybe I had gotten it wrong. Maybe there was another explanation. But no, the facts were right in front of me. I told her I'd be getting the documents to check the signatures myself. Her response was defensive. "You don't trust me? Your own mother? How could you even think I would do something like that for? What, money?" That's when she let it slip. She didn't say it outright, but there was something about the way she looked at me that made it click. This wasn't about her. This was about Ethan. My younger brother, the golden child. The one she'd do anything for. Ethan had been accepted to an Ivy League college, but he didn't have the money for tuition. And suddenly, things began to make sense. "You sold it for Ethan, didn't you?" The silence that followed was all the confirmation I needed. She didn't have to say a word. My own mother had betrayed me, all to help my brother. I could feel the anger rising in my chest. "I can't believe you," I muttered, standing up abruptly. "You sold my apartment for him, without even asking me. You forged my signature." She didn't say a word. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes fixed on me, cold and unyielding. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, her voice firm. "But you're making a big mistake, Daniel." I stormed out of the house. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe it. She had actually done it. She had sold my apartment, without my knowledge, without my consent, and worst of all, she had forged my name to do it. Over the next few days, I started gathering information. I got copies of the paperwork from the real estate agency, and sure enough, there was my signature on the sale documents. Except, it wasn't my signature. It was a pretty good forgery, though, almost convincing. But that wasn't the end of it. My mother had covered her tracks well, but not well enough. I found out she had also taken a substantial loan, using the apartment as collateral. And where did the money go? Straight into Ethan's college fund. I confronted my brother about it. He looked surprised, like he genuinely had no idea what was going on. And maybe he didn't. But that didn't change the fact that my mother had put my future on the line to secure his. I went to my friend Lucas for advice. He had been my best friend since high school and was always the one I could count on when things got tough. When I told him the whole story, his reaction mirrored mine. "You've got to sue her, man," he said bluntly. "You can't just let this slide." I knew he was right, but the thought of taking legal action against my own mother? It felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. But what choice did I have? She wasn't going to admit to anything. She wasn't even sorry. The betrayal felt like a weight on my chest, suffocating me. I had to do something. I couldn't let her get away with this. I left Lucas's house that night with a heavy heart, but a clear mind. I was going to sue my mother, and there was no turning back. I didn't expect my mother to admit what she did, but I guess I thought there would be some sort of remorse, some acknowledgement of the mess she had made. Instead, all I got was more denial, more gaslighting, and more mind games than I could handle. After I confronted her about the forged signature and the sale of the apartment, she went silent for a couple of days. No phone calls, no texts, nothing. It felt like she was hoping I would just forget the whole thing. That maybe, if she kept quiet long enough, I'd drop it. But I wasn't dropping anything. I couldn't. I was back at her house a week later, papers in hand, ready to make her face the facts. She opened the door and gave me this blank, almost rehearsed look. It felt like she'd been preparing for this conversation, like she had figured out how to manipulate me before I even walked through the door. "Daniel, I've already told you," she said as I walked into the living room. "I didn't forge your signature. I don't know where you're getting these ideas." I dropped the stack of papers on the coffee table in front of her, the noise louder than it needed to be. I was furious, but I was trying to keep it together. "These are the documents, Mom. That's not my signature. And you know it." She barely glanced at them. "You're imagining things, sweetheart. You've been so stressed lately. You're always working so hard. It's natural to make mistakes or misremember things when you're under pressure." Her words stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. She was acting like I was the crazy one, like I was too stressed to think straight. The worst part? A small part of me started to wonder if she was right. Had I misread the situation? Could it have been some sort of mix-up? But no. The facts were right in front of me. She forged my signature. She sold my apartment. And she lied about it. "Don't try to twist this around, Mom. I'm not imagining anything. The apartment is gone, and the money went straight to Ethan's college fund. You can't deny that." Her face changed then, just for a split second. It was a flicker of something. Guilt? Anger? But just as quickly, she composed herself, leaning back in her chair like she had all the time in the world. "Daniel, honey, Ethan needed the money. You know how important his education is. And you've never even lived in that apartment. You don't need it." I felt the anger bubbling up inside me, my hands clenched into fists. "That's not the point. It's my apartment. Dad left it to me. You don't get to make that decision for me." She sighed heavily, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Daniel, you're blowing this out of proportion. You're being dramatic. We're family. Families help each other. Not like this." I shouted, unable to hold back anymore. "You forged my signature, Mom. Do you understand how serious that is? You could go to jail for that." Her expression hardened. "I would never go to jail." "Don't be ridiculous." The casual way she dismissed the consequences of what she had done shook me to my core. It was like she genuinely believed she was untouchable, that she could do whatever she wanted, and there would never be any fallout. That she was above the law because she was doing it for family. I left her house that day more confused and angry than ever. It wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about the lies, the manipulation, the way she twisted everything to make it seem like I was the one in the wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't just let it slide. Later that evening, I called Lucas. I needed to talk it out with someone who wasn't involved, someone who could give me a straight answer. "I don't know, man," I said, pacing around my apartment, the phone pressed to my ear. "She's making me feel like I'm overreacting, like maybe I'm being too hard on her. But at the same time, I know what she did. I have the proof." Lucas didn't hesitate. "You're not overreacting, Daniel. She forged your damn signature. That's not something you just forget about because she's your mom. She stole from you. And she's trying to manipulate you into thinking you're crazy for calling her out on it. I just can't believe she'd do this. And the worst part is, she doesn't even care. She's acting like it's no big deal. That's because she thinks she can get away with it. She's your mom. She figures you won't take it any further. But you need to do something about this, Daniel. You can't let her walk all over you. I knew he was right. But still, the idea of taking legal action against my own mother? It felt wrong. It felt like I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But what other choice did I have? She wasn't going to admit to anything. And she definitely wasn't going to make things right on her own. I'm thinking about suing her, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I think you have to, Lucas finally said. She's not leaving you any choice. I don't know if I can do that. She's my mom. Yeah, and you're her son. That didn't stop her from screwing you over. Don't let her guilt trip you into backing down. The guilt was already there, gnawing at the back of my mind. But so was the anger. So was the betrayal. I couldn't let her get away with this, no matter how much it hurt to admit what she had done. Over the next few days, I started looking into lawyers. Every time I made a call or sent an email, a little part of me wanted to stop, to just let it go. But I couldn't. Every time I thought about my apartment, being sold behind my back, the rage came flooding back. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed completely oblivious to the whole situation. When I tried to talk to him about it, he shrugged it off. Mom said she handled everything. I didn't know you were upset about it, he said with that carefree tone that made me want to scream. Of course, he didn't know. Why would he? He was the one benefiting from all of this. He had his college tuition paid for. Meanwhile, I was left to deal with the fallout. By the end of that week, I had my first meeting with a lawyer. Her name was Grace, and she didn't pull any punches. This is a serious case, Daniel, she said, her eyes scanning the forged documents I had brought with me. Forgery? Fraud? If we go through with this, your mother could lose a lot more than just the money. I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. I knew what this would mean. It wouldn't just be a lawsuit. It would be the end of my relationship with her. But maybe that relationship had ended the moment she decided to forge my signature and sell my apartment. We'll need more evidence, Grace continued. But if what you're saying is true, you have a strong case. Are you ready to move forward? I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I nodded anyway. This was happening. The day I officially filed the lawsuit against my mother felt surreal. I had rehearsed the decision in my mind so many times that, when it finally happened, it was almost like I was on autopilot. The legal papers were signed, the lawyer was confident, and there was no turning back. I was suing my own mother. Grace, my lawyer, had warned me that this would get ugly. I believed her, but I didn't really understand how bad it could get until the legal process started. It was one thing to accuse my mother of forging my signature. It was something entirely different to stand by it in front of strangers, lawyers, judges, and eventually, a jury. Karen's reaction when she was served the lawsuit was explosive, to say the least. She showed up at my apartment, banging on the door like she was trying to knock it down. When I opened it, she stormed inside, her face red with anger. "How dare you?" she screamed. "How could you do this to me? To your family? You've lost your mind, Daniel." I stood there, stunned by the intensity of her rage. For a second, I thought about backing down, but then I remembered the apartment, the forgery, the lies. "You left me no choice, Mom," I said quietly. "You didn't even try to make things right. You lied to me. What else was I supposed to do? You're my son." She spat, pacing the room. "You don't sue your own mother. This is what families do for each other. I did it for Ethan, for your brother. How can you not understand that?" There it was again, her constant justification, as if Ethan's college education made everything okay, as if I should have been fine with losing the apartment just because he needed money. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the betrayal. "You forged my signature," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You sold my property without even talking to me. Do you realize how insane that is?" She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes narrowing. "I did what I had to do. Ethan needed that money. And you've always been fine. You don't need that apartment. You have a good job, Your own place? What would you even do with it? I clenched my fists, trying to hold back the anger. She still didn't get it. She still thought she had the right to make decisions for me, as if my life didn't matter as much as Ethan's. I'm done talking about this, I said finally. We'll handle it in court. She didn't say anything after that. She just turned and walked out, slamming the door behind her. As soon as she was gone, I collapsed onto the couch, the weight of what I'd just done crashing down on me. This was my mother. I had sued my own mother. How did it get to this point? The first few weeks after filing the lawsuit were a blur of meetings with Grace and her team. She was thorough, going over every detail, making sure we had all the documentation in place. The forgery was clear as day, but she warned me that my mother would fight tooth and nail to make it seem like I was the one in the wrong. And she was right. When the legal proceedings finally began, Karen's lawyer painted her as the victim, a poor, well-meaning mother who had simply made a mistake while trying to help one of her sons. They tried to make it sound like I was overreacting, that I was cruel for dragging her through the courts over what they called a family matter. The first day in court was a nightmare. I sat there, listening as her lawyer twisted everything. According to them, I was ungrateful, heartless, and selfish for putting my mother through this. They painted Ethan as the struggling younger brother who needed help, and me as the uncaring older sibling who refused to offer any support. Ethan was dragged into it, too. He was called as a witness, even though I had told him to stay out of it. He didn't want to be there, I could tell. When he took the stand, he looked uncomfortable, his eyes flicking between our mother and me. I didn't know about any of this, Ethan said when they asked him about the sale. Mom said she was taking care of things. I didn't think there was a problem. He wasn't lying. But the way he said it made me look like the villain, like I was the one who was making a mountain out of a molehill. The tension between Ethan and me had been simmering under the surface for weeks, and now it was boiling over. After his testimony, I confronted him outside the courtroom. You're really going to stand there and pretend this isn't a big deal? I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. She sold my apartment, Ethan. She forged my signature. Do you even care? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, looking torn. I don't know what you want me to say, Dan. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask her to do any of it. But I'm not going to stand here and take sides. This whole thing is messed up. Of course it's messed up, I snapped. But you're letting her get away with it. You're just standing there like none of this matters. I'm not letting her get away with anything, he shot back, his voice rising. But she's still our mom, Dan. I don't want to see her dragged through the mud. I stared at him, dumbfounded. You don't want to see her dragged through the mud? She stole from me, Ethan. This isn't about hurting her. It's about making sure she's held accountable. Ethan shook his head, his face clouded with frustration. This whole thing is a mess. I don't want to be in the middle of it. He walked away before I could say anything else, leaving me standing there, feeling more alone than ever. As the trial went on, more skeletons started tumbling out of the closet. It turned out my mother had been playing fast and loose with finances for years. I uncovered bank records showing that she had taken out multiple loans in my name without my knowledge, using my credit to keep herself afloat. She had been gambling with my future long before this apartment sale, and I hadn't even known it. Grace was relentless, digging deeper into my mother's financial dealings. The more we uncovered, the more disgusted I became. My mother, the woman I had trusted more than anyone, had been using me for years. I wasn't just a son to her, I was a resource. By the time we reached the final stages of the trial, it wasn't just about the apartment anymore. It was about everything. The lies, the manipulation, the way she had taken advantage of my trust. And still, Karen refused to admit she had done anything wrong. Even as the evidence piled up against her, she sat in that courtroom with her head held high, insisting she had done everything for the family. For Ethan. I didn't recognize her anymore. The woman sitting across from me in that courtroom wasn't my mother. She was a stranger. The case dragged on for weeks, each day feeling like another cut to an already open wound. I could see the strain it was putting on everyone. On Ethan, on me, on the rest of the family. But there was no going back. I had made my choice. I had to see this through, no matter the cost. The deeper we got into the lawsuit, the more the pressure built. Each day in court felt like another crack in the foundation of what was once my family. I was seeing sides of my mother I never thought existed, and every new piece of evidence chipped away at any hope of reconciliation. I didn't want to destroy her, but I couldn't let her get away with what she'd done. As Grace kept uncovering more of my mother's financial dealings, Karen started losing ground in court. The evidence was overwhelming, and it became clear that this wasn't just about the apartment anymore. She had been siphoning money through different accounts for years, and not just from me. It turned out that she had borrowed against her own house, maxed out several credit cards, and was using all kinds of shady tactics to keep her financial house of cards standing. Her facade of control and righteousness was starting to crumble, but rather than owning up to her actions, she retaliated in the worst way. Karen started making public scenes, both in and out of the courtroom. One afternoon, after a particularly damning day in court where Grace presented clear evidence of the forgery, Karen stood up in front of everyone and made a tearful outburst, loud enough that the entire courtroom stopped. "I'm a mother," she cried, her voice breaking. "Everything I've ever done was for my children. Daniel is being manipulated. He's forgotten what family means." The whole room fell into an awkward, tense silence. Her voice was high-pitched, desperate, and emotional. It was like she was trying to sway the jury with sympathy, hoping her dramatic display would paint me as the ungrateful son who was destroying his poor, loving mother. But to me, it just felt like another level of manipulation. The court officers gently escorted her out after the outburst, and I sat there, staring at the floor, feeling my stomach twist into knots. It didn't stop there. Karen took her act public, talking to neighbors, friends, and anyone who would listen. She spun the story to make it seem like I was attacking her, turning her own son against her. I started getting phone calls from extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years, all of them asking how I could do this to my own mother. The emotional burden of the case was starting to weigh on me heavily. I couldn't sleep. My days were filled with stress, anxiety, and the constant feeling that my entire life was spiraling out of control. My relationships with other people started to strain, too. Even Lucas, my closest friend, was worried about me. He could see how the lawsuit was tearing me apart, and though he supported me, he warned me about what might happen next. "Dan, you've got to be careful," Lucas said one night when we were out for a drink, trying to get away from the pressure for a few hours. "I know your mom did you dirty, and you have every right to be angry, but this case, it's going to leave a mark. You're not just suing her, you're nuking your relationship with her. Maybe even with Ethan, too." "I don't have a choice," I muttered, staring into my glass. "She doesn't think she's done anything wrong. If I drop this, she'll just keep doing it. To me, to Ethan, she's never going to stop." Lucas nodded slowly, but his eyes were heavy with concern. "I get it, man. But at what cost? You've already lost so much because of this. Just make sure winning this case doesn't mean losing everything else." I didn't say anything, but his words stuck with me. I had already lost so much. My peace of mind, my connection to my mother, and now even my sense of who I was. I was constantly angry, constantly on edge. I barely recognized myself anymore. Lucas was right. I didn't want to lose everything, but the closer we got to the end of this lawsuit, the more it felt like I was burning every bridge in my life. The final blow came when Ethan and I had a confrontation that changed everything. He showed up at my apartment one evening, out of the blue. His face was tight with frustration, and I could tell from the way he was standing that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. I gestured for him to come in, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. As soon as he stepped inside, he turned to face me, his arms crossed over his chest. "This whole thing," Ethan began, "this lawsuit, it's going to ruin our family, Daniel. You know that, right?" I had heard this before. Everyone was talking about how I was the one causing the rift, how my decision to sue was tearing the family apart. But I was tired of hearing it. "She's the one who did this, Ethan. I didn't force her to forge my signature or sell my apartment. She made those choices." Ethan shook his head. "You think I don't know that? I'm not saying she didn't mess up, but you've escalated it to this point. You're going to destroy her. Do you even care?" I clenched my fists, my frustration bubbling to the surface. Do I care? Are you serious? She's the one who didn't care about me. She forged my signature, sold my apartment, and has been lying to us for years. How can you stand there and ask if I care when she's the one who put us in this mess? Ethan sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Look, there's something you don't know. Something Mom told me that I didn't want to believe, but now, I think you should hear it. I frowned, suddenly on edge. What are you talking about? Ethan took a deep breath. Mom didn't just forge your signature for the apartment. She's been moving money around for years because she's in deep trouble. She's been gambling. I found out a few months ago, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make things worse. She's in debt, Dan. Serious debt. She's been using our names to keep herself afloat. The apartment, that was just the latest thing. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Gambling? I had suspected she was hiding something. But this was worse than I could have imagined. She's been gambling? I repeated, my voice hollow. Ethan nodded grimly. Yeah, and she's been using you to cover it up. That's why she sold the apartment. That's why she's been shifting money around. She's in way over her head, and instead of dealing with it, she's been using us. I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. All this time, I had been so focused on the forgery, on the sale of the apartment, but now I was realizing there was an entire web of lies beneath the surface. My own mother, gambling away everything she had, and everything I had. I sat down heavily on the couch, my mind reeling. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. I didn't know what to do, Ethan said quietly, sitting down across from me. I didn't want to make things worse. But now I think you need to know the truth. Everything was starting to fall apart. The lawsuit, the lies, the gambling. It was all unraveling before my eyes. I wasn't just suing my mother for forging my signature anymore. I was uncovering a mess of financial deceit that had been poisoning my family for years. As Ethan sat there, watching me process the information, I realized that no matter what happened in court, I had already lost. My family was broken, shattered by the lies we had been living with for so long. And even if I won the lawsuit, the victory would be hollow. The day of the verdict was the longest day of my life. I had spent weeks sitting in that courtroom, watching everything unravel, but nothing could prepare me for the final blow that was about to come. I sat there, my stomach in knots, as the judge reviewed the evidence one last time before delivering the decision. Karen was sitting just a few feet away from me, her face a mask of calm, but I could see the cracks beneath the surface. She had been trying to hold it together for the duration of the trial, but the weight of everything, the gambling, the forgery, the lies, was starting to show. She looked smaller than I remembered, like the confident, controlling woman I once knew had been chipped away piece by piece. Ethan wasn't in the courtroom. He had made it clear that he didn't want to be a part of the final day. After his revelation about Mom's gambling addiction, he had pulled away from both of us. I couldn't blame him. He had been caught in the middle of a battle that he never asked to be a part of. And now, he was done. I hadn't heard from him in days. As the judge began to speak, I felt my pulse quicken, my palms damp with sweat. This was it, the moment that would determine the future of my family, or whatever was left of it. After reviewing the evidence presented, it is the court's judgment that the defendant, Karen, did indeed engage in forgery and fraudulent activity. The evidence is clear that she used her son's signature without his consent to sell property that did not belong to her. As such, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Daniel. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I had one. I should have felt relief, some sense of vindication after everything I had been through. But instead, all I felt was an emptiness in the pit of my stomach. The judge continued, outlining the penalties Karen would face. She would have to pay restitution for the money she had taken, and the forgery charges would likely lead to further legal consequences down the line. But none of it felt like a victory. The person I was suing was my mother. The price she was paying was everything. As I stood there, watching her reaction, I expected her to break down, to show some sign of regret or remorse. But instead, she just stared straight ahead, her face pale and emotionless. I couldn't tell if she was in shock, or if she was still trying to convince herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. The courtroom emptied out slowly, but I stayed in my seat, unable to move. People around me congratulated me in hushed tones, but their words felt distant, like they weren't really directed at me. Grace, my lawyer, gave me a small smile and a nod, but even she seemed to understand that this was a hollow victory. Winning this case hadn't just cost my mother everything. It had cost me too. Eventually, Karen stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't look at me as she gathered her things and left the courtroom. I wanted to say something to her, but the words wouldn't come. What was there left to say? She had lied, manipulated, and betrayed me in ways I could never have imagined. And yet, watching her leave like that, I didn't feel any satisfaction. I just felt lost. Outside the courthouse, the weight of everything hit me all at once. I sat down on a bench, staring at the street, wondering how we had gotten to this point. How had it come to a courtroom battle between mother and son? Where had things gone so wrong? Lucas showed up not long after, his familiar presence grounding me in the middle of the emotional storm I was in. He sat next to me without saying a word, waiting until I was ready to talk. "I won," I said finally, the words sounding flat and hollow. "I heard," Lucas replied quietly, "but I don't think that's the win you were hoping for." I shook my head, my eyes fixed on the ground. "No, it doesn't feel like a win at all." "You did what you had to do," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Your mom," she crossed a line. "A lot of lines. You couldn't let her get away with that." "I know," I muttered. "But now, what's left? Ethan's gone. My mom lost everything. What do I have?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He knew better than anyone how much this lawsuit had taken out of me. My friendships had suffered, my work had suffered, and my mental health had taken a nosedive. But most of all, my family had crumbled. And for what? The truth? "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel like a win," Lucas said after a long pause. "But it doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing. Your mom needed to be held accountable. You couldn't just let her keep doing this. Not to you. Not to anyone." I nodded, but the ache in my chest didn't ease. I had chosen truth over family, and now I was left with the consequences. A few days after the verdict, I got a call from Ethan. I hadn't expected to hear from him again, not after our last conversation. But there he was, his name flashing on my phone. I hesitated before answering, unsure of what he would say. When I finally picked up, his voice was quiet, distant. "Hey, Dan," he said. "I just wanted to say, I don't know what to say, actually." I waited, giving him the space to find his words. I could tell he was struggling, just like I was. "I'm sorry about everything," Ethan continued. "About Mom. About how I handled all of this. I didn't know how to deal with it. I still don't. But I need some time away from all of it. From you. From her. I need to figure things out." His words stung, but I couldn't blame him. I had dragged him into a battle that he didn't want to be a part of, and now he was doing what he had to do to protect himself. I understood that. "I get it," I said quietly. "Take all the time you need." There was a long silence before he replied. "I hope we can figure things out one day. But right now, I just can't." The line went dead, and I sat there, staring at my phone, feeling more alone than ever. Ethan had distanced himself from both of us, and I didn't know if we'd ever repair the damage that had been done. In the end, Karen lost everything. Her financial security, her family, her reputation. And though I had won the case, I was left with nothing but a bittersweet victory. The truth had come out, but at what cost? And so, the verdict was rendered. But the real cost of the truth wasn't something the courtroom could measure. It was the silence that followed, the empty spaces where family used to be. And that, perhaps, was the hardest part of all. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.